Today I shall be talking quite a lot about myself, so I think that'll make up for the deficiencies of the first two lectures. Basically this afternoon, thank you very much for coming, by the way. It's very kind of you, and it's a lovely day outside because there's a slight breeze and you can walk around and feel quite comfortable. So I appreciate the fact that you've, given up some of your afternoon to come and hear me talk. It's always a pleasure for me to talk to young people and to talk. It's always a pleasure for me to talk about紅樓夢, but I have to stop talking about紅樓夢one of these days because I'm starting to become terribly boring and repetitive. So what I'm going to do today is only rather loosely connected with the title which I provided to this very kind college. Before I go any further, allow me to say how grateful I am to this college, which is a very wonderful institution, and they treat me so well, and the wonderful team in the translation school, most of whom are outside, so I can say this without embarrassing them, although there's one of them here, and Esther and Sean and Terrific and these people, they really know how to treat you. I mean, I sometimes just pop in there just to have a chat, because they're so friendly and they're so helpful, and it's one of the reasons why I've come back is because I'm made to feel at home here, which is a very nice feeling for someone in my stage in life. So I'd like to say a big thank you to all the people here, not just Gilbert and Shelby, but also the people on the ground floor, the team, because I know how important those teams are. They are really what makes the difference, in Hong Kong. So many I worked in the Australian National University for about 10 years as the head of the Chinese program, and we had nobody. We had no help at all. I had to do all my own photocopying. I had to go and post letters in the post office. I mean, it's ridiculous. They just this budget cuts. They just removed all of our assistants, and as a result, senior professors were spending their time standing in front of photocopying machines, which is the most ridiculous waste of time. And anyway, so this is very common nowadays, and I think Hong Kong is a good exception to that, because you have a wonderful in Hong Kong there's a wonderful demographic of highly trained, highly intelligent people who can provide this kind of support, and they do it with enthusiasm, they do it with extraordinary politeness, and I do appreciate that enormously. It's one of the many things I miss about Hong Kong, which is a city that I hold very dear to my heart. And I'm not going to start getting into politics, okay? And so today I'm talking about two things, and they're very loosely connected. The general title of the talk is called Hearing the Sound, 知音, or The Art of Doing Things Differently. That could be the title for almost anything you like. It's a very good all-purpose title. But I'm basically going to talk about two things. You can look at that while I'm rabbiting on, but I'm going to talk about, first of all, my own experience, my own. Last time I talked quite a lot about David Hawkes, and 2 years ago I spoke about David Hawkes. Well, the first half of today's talk is going to be largely about me, so I'm terribly sorry about that. I think I have to do it, because otherwise I can't really leave myself out of the picture completely. The story of the collaboration, which, as I've talked about in some detail, was a collaboration between a master and an apprentice. I think you all know what an apprentice is. And of course, it's a very Chinese concept that a master takes on a student. Like I have a wonderful former PhD student called Deng Wanxia, or Tang Yunha. She's an opera singer, and she studied in Shanghai with the great master Yu Zhenfei, who was one of the great performers of Kunqiu opera. And to become his student, she had to perform a ceremony, Bai Ta Wei Lao Shi. She actually had to kind of perform this whole ceremony, and he accepted her formally as his student, That's a very wonderful tradition in Chinese culture. And I myself, in my relationship with David Hawkes, it was just like that. I buyed him to be my Lao Shi, and he eventually became my father-in-law and my friend. So it was a very close relationship, but it was always master and apprentice. The apprentice is the Western word. Of course, the Chinese would call it a disciple. I don't use the word disciple because it has religious overtones, and this was not a religious relationship. It was an extremely secular relationship. But you see, this relationship is very, very important, and it's why I still believe that in the teaching of translation, and I've taught translation in so many places in Hong Kong, the relationship between the teacher and the student is of absolute supreme importance, which is why these programs must never abandon those long projects. Because if I look back at my time teaching, it was during those one-on-one sessions with students when I looked at their translations and we went over them in detail, one-on-one, one was able to establish this kind of relationship with a student. And that's how they learn. That's how they have to learn. And that's why these programs, which are all like online, nowadays, are absolutely disastrous, You can't, of course, the internet's very useful for lots of things, but it will never replace the relationship between a teacher and a student. Never. It can't. Because in the end, the machine, the computer's just a machine, It can just process materials, but it cannot communicate. The old Chinese idea of Quotation, transmitting something vocally. Literally, you speak to someone and the stuff comes out of your mouth and it goes into their ears and eventually into their, insides. And that's how it happens. That's how it happened to me. Okay, so I'm going to today talk about two things. First of all, myself and how I came to become a translator. And before I met David Hawkes, I'm talking about my early life, more or less from the day I was born, right? So be prepared for some pretty, stupid stuff. And then the second half, I'm going to look very, very closely, minute detail at one chapter of紅樓夢translated by David, and I'm going to look at the manuscript of that, the manuscript of his very first draft, which is in the library of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And I've reproduced the 24 pages. And if I've still got enough energy by that stage, I'm going to go over tiny details to show you how a great master actually works, It's like I've got a video of Yu Zhenfei doing his, whatever he does, and I'm going to go through a slow motion showing you exactly how he moves his legs, how he moves his arms, and how he sings from here, not from here, all this kind of very detailed stuff, which is the very essence of translation. It's got nothing to do with translation theory, nothing to do with that at all. It's about how things actually happen, It's putting the thing under the microscope in a laboratory so that we see the little creatures actually living and working, And I thought I would begin with this quotation. It's a quotation from myself, I'm afraid, but I gave this to some students once as the conclusion of a course. I said we must never lose sight of the deep and indestructible connections between translation and literature and life. If what we write is to have a chance of living on the page, then we must also live. We must observe life. We must experience and learn to transmute that experience. Translators no less than creative writers. This is one of my pet themes, People come to me and say, how can I translate this? And I say, my dear young lady, because they're nearly always ladies, right, for some reason. That's not my fault. I'm not like Yuan Mei with my shunyu. The thing is that 99% of the students throughout the world who study languages happen to be women. That's the fact. It's statistical fact. Boys don't bother, Boys think they have more important things to do with life than learn languages or translate. So anyway, a young lady comes to me and says, how am I going to translate D.H. Lawrence into Chinese? Look at this chapter. And I say, my dear young lady, you're 23 years old. What have you experienced in your life? How many times have you been in love? How many times have you had your heart broken? Where have you traveled? What have you done in your life? Oh, I've never left Hong Kong. I've only ever had one boyfriend, and he's very nice. I said, well, my dear lady, don't translate D.H. Lawrence, please, because D.H. Lawrence was an extremely unusual, complicated, and in my opinion, rather questionable individual. And in order to understand D.H. Lawrence, you have to have lived. In fact, in order to understand Cao Xueqin, you have to have lived. In order to understand Su Dongpo, you have to have lived. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to go out there and be a sort of, gangster and kill people and stuff. It just means you have to have at least a life of the imagination. You have to have an experience of life that enables you to look at things and live and breathe what's going on. You can't just translate from a sort of dictionary and a few lessons in class about the grammar, and it's about life. Literature is. I'm talking about translating literature, of course. I'm not talking about legal translation. I dare say legal translation you can do without ever setting foot outside your office, provided you know about the law. Although I'm not even sure about legal, but still. Anyway, and this is by way of an introductory note, because I'm going to be talking about life, you see. So I thought I might justify myself by giving you this little quote. I've got this machine here. Let me just try. I never know which way to do it now. I think it's that way. Oh, yes. Okay. So now I've rewritten the timeline of my life, and I've actually had to divide it into two because it got a bit long. And we've probably come back to it. Oh, there's a misprint in the third line. I'm so sorry. Two misprints, actually. Oh, dear. I'll go through the dates because it'll help you to get a general sense of the chronology of my life. I was born in 1946, immediately after the Second World War, and my father, who'd been in the army, he came back towards the end of 45 and was very happy to be reunited with my mother, and 9 months later I was born. I need make no comment about how that happened, but I was a post-war baby, you see, and that's how it all started. And when I was a young boy, at the age of 12, I managed to get a scholarship to a school called Winchester College. I'm going to be talking about that later, so I'll just keep moving on. But I was incredibly fortunate to get into this school. And then after finishing my studies at this college, I went to study classical piano. Sorry, not classical Pinot, which sounds like a kind of wine. I didn't, in fact, have enough money to buy wine in those days, but I went to study classical piano because my great dream in life was to become a pianist. And I didn't give up that dream for a very long time. And so I went to Vienna and studied classical piano for about 6 months. And then I went up to Oxford, and eventually I settled for studying Chinese in 1966. And I came to Hong Kong to spend some time trying to learn a bit of spoken Chinese, because I knew nothing. And that was my undergraduate studies, you see. I was by that stage 20 years old. When I came to Hong Kong for the very first time 52 years ago, probably before any of your parents were born, I was 20 years old. And Hong Kong was a very, very different place in 1966, very, very different. They still had the old Bank of China building, and next to the old Bank of China building was a cricket pitch, And I was telling a friend last night that when I was here in 1966, I had so little money. My father was terribly mean. He gave me £6 a week. I don't know how I could live on £6 a week, and I ran out of money almost immediately, and I went into the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, which was the old building in those days, and I went up to the counter, and I said to this young man, he was English, I said, I really need an overdraft. I need some money. I'm very out of money. He said, my dear person, how can I give you an overdraft? Do you have any security? Do you have any salary? I said, no, I have nothing. But I need a few $1,000s, please, a few $1,000s to survive. And he just looked at me, and I knew he wasn't going to be very friendly. So I said to him, oh, by the way, what's the score in the cricket test? Because there was a cricket match going on between England and Australia, I think. Oh, and he said, oh, they're 375 for 7. Oh, I said, my goodness, we've got a hope then. And the minute he got into this conversation about cricket, you see, he realized that we had something in common. And then he just said, how much do you need? And I said, well, I could do with about 5,000. Oh, well, here you are. He said, I'll give you overdraft for 5,000. I had nothing, no security, no salary, and that was Hong Kong in 1966. If I went in there now, you can imagine what would happen to me, And that was a different world altogether. And then then I went back to Oxford to complete my undergraduate studies. And in 1967, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, David Hawkes came back from a sabbatical year, and he agreed to teach me紅樓夢. That's how the whole thing started. But of course, as I've mentioned before, I had heard of紅樓夢in Hong Kong from the family I was living with, from the old mother. She was a bit like Jamu, and she said to me, you know, if you want to understand us, any Chinese family, anything about China, you have to read one book, and it's called紅樓夢. And she was a very bossy lady, and I had to say, yes, I will. And when I went back to Oxford, I did study it. And then I graduated from Oxford in 1968. And at that point, I sort of dropped out. I'll talk about that later. But in the late 60s, you know, in England, people were all dropping out, you know. And in fact, it was called tuning in and dropping out, which basically meant you didn't get a job, you were unemployed, and you just sort of hung out with your friends and did nothing, you know. And that's, for me, this lasted for a very long time because I was quite happy doing nothing, except that I wasn't really doing nothing. I started to translate紅樓夢in my spare time. And that lasted for several years. In the meantime, I got married, you see. I can't separate translation from life. I fell in love, I got married, and then very tragically, my very wonderful wife, she died at a very, very young age. She was 24 years old when she died, and it was a tragedy which I experienced. And I often think that the only reason I was able to translate the death of Lin Daiyu was because I had experienced firsthand, literally sitting next to this wonderful lady for a month in hospital, I had experienced firsthand what it meant for a very young and very beautiful woman to die. And that was part of my life experience. Oh dear, I've turned the whole thing off. Oh God. Okay, and then I had a period of some years which were very hard. I suppose one would just call them years of grief, right? Which is another human emotion that one inevitably experiences at some point in one's life. And then I was very fortunate to meet another very wonderful person and to get married a second time, and we went to Australia, and that was like the second beginning of my life. I was very, very fortunate to be offered an extremely generous scholarship to go to the Australian National University and do my PhD. And those 3.5 years when I was doing my PhD were some of the happiest years of my life, because all I had to do was read books and have lovely thoughts. You know, it's wonderful to be paid to have lovely thoughts. I mean, where else does it happen, you know, in the world? So I was very fortunate, and I had a wonderful teacher. There he is up there. Can I get this red thing to work? Yes. This man was my second kind of father figure, Liu Cunren, and he often came to Hong Kong. In fact, he moved to Australia from Hong Kong, and he was a Cantonese speaking. Well, he spoke Cantonese, Shanghai-hua, Shandong-hua, and of course Guoyu. So he was a man who knew everything. He was a walking encyclopedia, but he was also a very wonderful man, and became my very good friend. And then after that, I had to become a sort of grown-up, you know. All those years I never really wanted to be a grown-up. I wanted to be like Peter Pan, forever young, you know. And people thought that was a bit silly, but I'm a bit like that now, actually. I can't believe I'm nearly 72 years old. I feel like I'm about 7, you know. And one day Tinkerbell will fly through the window, and I'll just go flying off to Neverland with her, and forget about all of this. This is just a dream. You're not really here today. I'm just dreaming this, you see. And I'll wake up and find that I'm really, you know, not here at all. Anyway, that's beside the point. So I finished the work on紅樓夢, you see, in 1986. But all this time, during all this time, I was obliged to do a job and to teach. And I spent all these years in various universities in China, in Hong Kong, in Australia and New Zealand, until quite recently when I retired. So I've been a university teacher since then. And, right. So let's go back to the beginning. I mean, I was born, as I told you, the son of a British Army officer, and then later on my father joined the British Foreign Office, the Waijiaobu, right? He became a diplomat. He was a very good diplomat, actually, and he was sent all over the world. So I traveled all over the world as a young boy. And I grew up in South America, in Venezuela and Argentina. The first language I ever learnt was Spanish. I spoke Spanish to my nanny. I had a nanny. It was quite common in those days. And she was black. She was from the Caribbean island of Trinidad. And her name was Ivy. And I loved her enormously. She was very big. And I used to just bury myself in her enormous bosom and feel very happy. And she always called me her cheating child because, my mother was much too busy going to diplomatic cocktail parties. So I spent most of the first 6 years of my life with a big black nanny. I don't know whether that influenced me in any way, but it was a fact. And then my father was sent to Egypt. And we lived in Cairo, which is a very different place then from what it is now. And we lived in fact, I managed to find these photographs on the internet of the area where we lived. It was called, is this a red thing? It was called Zamalek. And it was the old French quarter of Cairo. And we lived in a very interesting old building. This is the street name of the street where I lived as a small boy, called Rue Aziz Osman. And this area of Cairo is a very smart kind of, a lot of embassies there, a lot of people like my father, diplomats living there. And that was really where I first started to sort of become conscious of certain things, including music. I'll talk about that a bit later. Well, no, I'll talk about it now. That's for later, sorry. Now, when I was in Egypt at the age of about 7, some of you may have this experience, but for a child, if your parents start to argue, it's quite disturbing. I mean, my parents started to argue a lot, and eventually they got divorced, actually. But I was very upset. I'd come home from school, and they'd be sitting in the study, shouting at each other and calling each other horrible names. And I was very unhappy about that as a young boy. I was quite sensitive. And at around about this time, the man who lived opposite, in the apartment opposite us, who I've completely forgotten the name of, he met me in the lift, and he said to me, "Oh, are you interested in playing the piano?" And I said, "Yes," although I hadn't really learned to play much. But he said, "If you ever want to play, just come over into my apartment, and you can play on my piano, because the apartment's empty all day, and my servant will look after you." So I thought that sounded wonderful. And almost immediately I took the opportunity of knocking on the door opposite. It was one of those old apartment buildings with a kind of lift in a cage, like in Hitchcock movies. You get into this lift and it's like being in a cage. Quite scary, actually. Anyway, I went into his apartment, and this very lovely Egyptian boy in a white gown greeted me and sort of bowed to me and showed me to the piano, because he'd been instructed to do this. So I sat down at this piano, and I felt so wonderful, because, across the row, across the landing in my apartment, I dare say my parents were having a good old argument, But I was over here, and it was quiet, and it was lovely, and the boy brought me a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice in a sort of lace container, put it on the piano, and I sat down and I played a few little pieces, and I felt very, very happy. So it was at this stage that playing the piano became a kind of secret world for me, a place where I could go when nobody could disturb me, where I could create my own inner world, my jingjie. I could sit there, and eventually I learned to play one or two pieces by Chopin and so on, Mozart, and I could play them, and nobody could take that away from me. And that has remained very central to my life ever since. I can date it. I mean, it's not often you can date things like that. I can date it back exactly to that time in my life when I was able to escape into a magical world which nobody could take away. And music has been very important to me ever since. And to be honest, I think that translation is a kind of music. Hence, the title of this talk is Hearing the Music, or Understanding the Music. It's about hearing the sound in your mind. And in the end, that is the mark of a truly great translator, is they can hear the sound. They don't need to spell out in words. They know They know, you see. And that's something that really began for me in Egypt when I was about 7 years old. Now, oh dear, this photograph is so embarrassing. When I sort of got a bit older, I was made to take a scholarship entrance to a very special school called Winchester College, which is probably the best school in England. It was founded in 1360, so it dates from the early years of the Ming dynasty, you know. And my goodness, look at the clothes we were wearing. We had to dress in this kind of medieval costume all the time. This wasn't for a special photograph. This was what we wore morning, noon, and night. And in that photograph, there's me. And I don't know if you can... I'm going to move the red thing. And if you can say which is me... Now, what, is it me? I want to hear a cry. It's you, okay? All right.
It's you.
Someone thinks that's me? No way. We'll go over here. These two people grew up to become doctors. He became a rugby player. I can't remember what happened to him. Okay, I hear a few voices saying yes. That was me, believe it or not, yes. And you see, we all had to wear these funny gowns, and if you had a velvet collar, that meant you were a prefect, you see. Only prefects could wear velvet collars and velvet lapels, and to my great shame, I was a prefect. And this person next to me, Nicholas Postgate, became the professor of Egyptian studies at Cambridge. So he and I were the great rivals. We always used to compete with each other. And I haven't seen him since school. You know, I'm not a sort of old school boy at all. And this is a picture of a Winchester scholar in the 18th century. So you see, nothing much has changed at Winchester. It's a very, very traditional, a very excellent school which has amazing libraries, a fantastic music department, 27 teachers of music in a secondary school, a huge concert hall. And I was spoilt for opportunities there. I was able to play music to my heart's content. I could do almost whatever I liked. It was a very wonderful school. Of course, and it had a superb chapel, which was built in the year 1387 to 1395. This is the original stained glass, you see. And this stained glass was taken down during the Second World War and hidden somewhere for safety in case there were bombs. And after the war, nobody could remember where it was hidden. So for many years they had plain glass, and then suddenly one day somebody remembered and they went downstairs to this basement, and there it all was, perfect condition. And I used to sing in the choir. These are the choir stalls here. I used to sing twice a day, 3 times on Sundays. I was a very big choir boy, you know. And I think I got pictures of the choir. Oh yeah, here's the choir, you see. It was a very good choir. That's not me, but I mean, I was standing in that row there. And these were the young boys, and this is a performance with an orchestra, but this was in the chapel. So I used to sing in the choir all the time, and it was a wonderful education. And of course, because we had to go to church twice a day, I used to hear the Bible read all the time. I wasn't a very good Christian, but I loved the Bible. And the influence of hearing that superb... They always read from the King James Bible, you know, 1611. And I remember those readings. They went right inside my head, you know. I've never, ever recovered from having had the King James Bible read to me twice a day for 5 years. It was a wonderful experience. And we also had some superb buildings in the grounds. This was the school building built by the architect Christopher Wren, who designed St. Paul's Cathedral. So, you know, Winchester College was an extraordinary place. It was a bit like the Guanyuan, you know, a bit like growing up in a kind of utopian paradise, really. A very beautiful place. This is an old picture of Winchester in 1815, and it hasn't changed much since then. And these cloisters, I used to walk around them. You know, cloisters are very special places that were designed originally in monasteries for monks to walk around, having beautiful thoughts about God or praying, and they would walk round and round the cloisters, meditating and praying. And I think I used to enjoy walking around these cloisters because they were so quiet, and you could have your own thoughts, and you could just meditate, and it was a very formative experience. And in the middle of this cloister, there was a small chapel where the young boys used to go for their services, and I used to play the piano for the services. That was the kind of life I led. It was a very special, very privileged life. And I hardly even had to choose what to study because it was all chosen for me, and I joined the classics stream. And in those days it was still quite a large stream of students who chose to study the classics, by which I mean Latin and Greek. Okay? And we spent a lot of time reading Homer, who, as you can see, he was blind. In fact, there were probably several people who were Homer. It was probably a kind of band of storytellers. And we read Homer, we read it aloud in class, and we translated it in class. And I have a memory which I will share with you. I had a wonderful teacher whose name was Francis King, and he was always known to be very aesthetic. He was always speaking about the beauty of things. We all thought he was quite a joke, actually. But looking back, he was a wonderful man. He liked to read Shakespeare and so on. And I never did my homework. You see, I was very lazy. I still am. And we had a class, we were translating Homer. And he would call out your name, you'd have to stand up. He'd say, Minford, translate. So I'd have to stand up and translate some lines of Homer from the Greek. But I hadn't done my homework, so often I had no idea what the Greek meant. So I'm sorry, this is not a very good story about me, but I would just say, I just can't think of quite the right word. And Mr. King would say, John, you're so sensitive. and then, of course, he'd translate it for me, which is the whole idea, right? So I got away with absolute murder, but still, it's not a very creditable. The story isn't a great credit to me, but it also illustrates that this man had a very deep influence on me. And we read not only Homer, of course, we read lots of other Greek writers, but we read. These are the opening lines of the Iliad, one of the two great poems. This is about Achilles. I'm not going to read it because I haven't got time, but there it is. And then we also read a much later poet called Theocritus, who is not nearly so famous. But I particularly liked Theocritus. He wrote poems about love and about shepherds and shepherdesses, and I think that's probably why I'm so fond of Sung Tzu, because I think Theocritus was the closest the Greeks had to a Sung Tzu poet. And we also had to translate Theocritus. And this is these are some of his famous lines. Look, still is the sea and still are the breezes, but the pain in my heart is not still. I mean, the Greeks had it all. They were absolutely marvelous, and they wrote the most wonderful poetry and drama as well, and of course historical prose, Thucydides, and we had to read all of this. And then we had to read Latin. We had to read Cicero, but we had to read two kinds of Latin. One was Ciceronic prose, and the other was Tacitus, because these were the two alternative styles of writing prose. So every week we'd have to write a piece of prose in Latin, a prose composition. It was like doing Guanyuan, we had to write an essay in Latin. Can you believe it? And we could choose whether to write in the style of Cicero or in the style of Tacitus. And Tacitus has a much more interesting, rather sharp style. Cicero is rather sort of flowing and rhetorical. And we had to learn how to do both. And that had a very big influence. We translated almost every day of the week, translated from the classics. And I did surprisingly well at Latin prose composition, and I was actually awarded the Queen's Gold Medal for Latin prose composition. And oh dear, wait a minute. And the teacher who really I pay homage to this teacher of mine who's no longer alive. He's the one who really got me interested in translation, because he seemed to think I was gifted in that direction. I had no idea. And as a result of his decision, I got this gold medal, which had the Queen's face on it, and gold medal for Latin prose. I'm ashamed to say I don't still have it, because a few years later, when I was a student at Oxford, I was terribly, terribly hard up, very poor, and I took the gold medal to the local jewellery shop and sold it for £5. I can't believe I did something so terrible, but and the man in the shop said, "I'm so sorry, sir, I can't give you much for it because it's got the Queen's head on it. We're not really allowed to melt down the Queen's head." But I said, "Don't worry, just give me £5, that's all I need. I just want to get a meal." And so I sold my Queen's Gold Medal. I wish I hadn't. And then the Latin poets, of course, were absolutely wonderful. Again, the Latin poet Catullus, perhaps my favorite of all the classical poets, and all he ever wrote was love poetry. He's very famous for it. I've got a few examples here for you. And he always called the woman he loved, he called her Lesbia. It wasn't her real name. And there's a very famous poem where he talks about Lesbia. This is a 19th century painting, by the way. Lesbia and the little sparrow. Because he wrote a famous poem about the sparrow who sits on Lesbia's hand, and he's so jealous of the sparrow because the sparrow is so close to Lesbia and can sort of, as it were, make love to the woman he loves. And the poem's very, very famous. And this is the one. "Sparrow, my girl's delight, with whom she plays, whom she holds in her lap, to whom she holds out her fingertip when you seek it, provoking your sharp bites when it pleases her to make some sweet joke, while my desire gleams. You are also, I think, the solace of her sorrow when my passionate fire dies down." So he's constantly comparing himself to this little sparrow, and his intense jealousy. "How I wish I could play with you the way she does herself and relieve the cares of my sad heart." That's the Latin. And one of his most famous poems is called Odi et Amo, I hate and I love. Why do I do this, you may ask? I do not know. But I can feel it happen and am riven with pain. That's a very, very short poem, but it's unforgettable. And then this is one of his most, there's some typos, sorry. That man seems to me, again, he's talking he's talking with intense jealousy about the woman he loves. That man seems to me equal to a god. That man, if such a thing is allowed, surpasses the gods, who, sitting continually before you, sees and hears your sweet laughter, which tears away all sense from wretched me. For when I look at you, Lesbia, the words in my mouth are nothing. My tongue is numb. A fine flame runs through my limbs. My ears ring. My eyes are covered by the night. I mean, this is very, very intense poetry written by a Roman poet, and of course you can see the lineage of this in so much Italian opera. And then also at my school, I was given the chance to act in plays. This, again, I see as a very formative thing, because what a wonderful opportunity. I actually played the part of Thomas More in the very famous play A Man for All Seasons. I had to dress up in this kind of costume. It was a very long performance. I had to learn all the words by heart. And it was a very formative experience for me as a young boy. I was only about 15 or 16. To learn to act, to learn to get underneath the skin of another person and perform as that person on the stage. And in a sense, I think this was also a part of a preparation for my subsequent years as a translator. And then, as I mentioned earlier, after I left school, I went to Vienna and spent 6 months studying the piano in Vienna, which is, of course, the world capital of music. And this left a very deep impression on me as well. It was in Vienna that I really felt connected to the mainstream of classical European music, the great Mozart, Schubert, Beethoven, and so on, which remained a very important part of my life. And I've always maintained that translating is very like interpreting a piece of music. You know, you have a text, but in the end you have to perform it. So although the text was written by somebody else, Cao Sui-qian or Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the performance is also yours. And I think very important to me, in Vienna, my teacher, a man called Walter Kamper, who was a very distinguished concert pianist, he used to teach me. Oh, what's happened there? Oh, okay. I'm going to sit down for a moment. I'm just getting a little bit tired, actually. Walter Kamper, my teacher, he had a very wonderful way of teaching. Oh, thank you, Sean. I'll try and get it in there. You can do it? Okay. Thank you. Now, there were two things about his teaching which I want to share with you. And please put your hand up if I've told you about this before. Have I mentioned Walter Kamper before? No. You know, I'm reaching the age where I forget what I've said before. Anyway, Walter Kamper was a most wonderful pianist. And he very kindly, I used to go and see him once a week. I used to practice for 8 hours a day in my apartment. And then I used to go for these lessons once a week. And two things about Walter Kamper which have really left a deep impression on me. One was that one week I didn't practice. I went away with a friend for the weekend to a small country town called Linz. Actually, that's where Hitler grew up, but that's beside the point. And there was a lot of beer drinking going on. And I went with my friend to all these late-night beer drinking parties and had a great time. And we spent the weekend sort of in a state of mild alcoholic confusion, and then went back to Vienna. And when I went to my lesson, I had to play my piece. It was a piece of Chopin. And my teacher, Walter Kamper, said, "John, you've made so much progress. That's wonderful." And he said, "You must have practiced very hard this week." And I said to him, "Walter, I'm afraid I didn't. I went on a short holiday." And he said, "Where did you go?" I said, "Oh, I went to Linz." "You should have told me. I went to Linz as well. We could have had a good time together." So he believed also that, of course, it's important to work hard, but it's also important to know how to relax and take time off, you know. I mean, sometimes, even when I'm here at Hang Seng College, I'm up in my little apartment and I just can't think anymore, so I just go out for a walk, you know. I go up the hill and look at the mountains or come down the hill and get myself a coffee, and you have to learn, you have to be able to combine hard work with the ability to just relax and allow natural, spontaneous flow to take place. That was one thing. The other thing that Walter taught me, which I think is directly connected to translation, is he would make me perform my piece, and he'd stop me halfway through. He'd close the book and he'd say, "Okay, now you make it up yourself." The first time he did, I just couldn't understand what he was talking. I said, "But I'm playing Chopin." No. You play what you think or you're feeling now. Just from here, you go on your own. So he was the first person to encourage me to improvise my own musical ideas as a way of entering into the spirit of the original classical piece. So I would have to play, and then he'd say, "Now come back to Chopin." And I'd try and find my way back to the original, and then he'd open the book and say, "Okay, now you can finish the piece." Now that to me was very original. And you see, I think it's a lesson we can apply to translation, because sometimes people just sit down at their desk and think, "Okay, I've got to translate," and they open the dictionary and they think, "Right, I'm going to translate." That's why I sometimes say to students, the first thing to do when you're translating is not to translate, right? Go for a walk, have a cup of tea, listen to some music, have a little snooze if you like, but in other words, don't regard it as a routine mechanical task, you know, because just like performing Chopin, a translator has to also put their own life's blood into what they're doing. Otherwise, the end result is completely dead. So you'll find that this is something that I myself apply a great deal to translation, and it's something that David Hawkes himself did as well, as I hope to demonstrate later on. Okay, I move on. So that was what I learnt when I was, learning the piano, and of course I didn't succeed in becoming a pianist. I had to give up that dream. I'm so glad I did, because I would have been a very third-rate pianist. But in the end, I became a translator, and I went back to Oxford. I went up to Oxford and studied at Oxford. But my first 2 years at Oxford, I just wasn't interested in studying at all. I was supposed to be studying politics, philosophy, and economics, and they just didn't interest me, because sometimes you're too young to go to university. You don't know what you really want, So you muddle around, and you have a girlfriend or whatever it is that you want to do, and then eventually, hopefully not too late, you suddenly realize, oh my God, I don't want to study this. I want to do something else. So after 2 years of studying politics, philosophy, and economics, none of which interested me at all, I was still learning the piano, and I didn't go to any lectures. I mean, I was a very bad student, I have to say. And then I decided, and in fact what I really enjoyed doing was directing theatre, directing plays. And I directed 2 plays in those first 2 years. One was Oscar Wilde's play Salome, which is a pretty wild play about a very beautiful young woman who wants the head of John the Baptist on a platter, And in fact, this is the next picture shows Salome with the head of John the Baptist. It's pretty heavy stuff, Salome. And she dances the dance of the 7 veils, And that was quite exciting for everybody in the theatre, because we had a very wonderful young lady from one of the girls' colleges who was very good at taking off her 7 veils. And we had music and everything. It was great fun. So that was something I really enjoyed doing. And then in my second year, I directed a play called The Assassination of Jean-Paul Marat, as performed by the inmates of Charenton Lunatic Asylum, directed by the Marquis de Sade. It's a very long title, that's why I didn't put the whole thing there. And that was a huge production involving about 50 people, and took up the whole of my summer. So I really wasn't a good student at all. And then that summer, I had a sort of crisis, I suppose. You wouldn't call it a midlife crisis. It was really an early life crisis. I think my entire life has been composed of one crisis after another, really. I don't know whether to... But I just decided, this is no good. I'm wasting my time. I really must do something sensible. And I think I have talked about this before. And that's when I chose Chinese. I chose it not in a logical, rational way, but in a completely irrational way, by divination. I opened the book of the university courses, and I just closed my eyes and put a pin in the book, and it ended up on Chinese. So that's how I decided to learn Chinese. And I went along the next day, and the very nice people in the Chinese department allowed me to change to Chinese. And that's how I started studying Chinese. You could say by chance, except that it's not chance at all. There is no such thing as chance. I chose it through divination. And of course, very much later in my life, I translated the great Chinese work of divination called the I Ching. And in fact, what I was doing in 1966, without knowing it, was a bit like consulting the I Ching. And it led me into Chinese, and I haven't stopped since. And that's 52 years ago, you see. So I've had no regrets. Clearly, I was supposed to be doing this thing. And this is the new building of Chinese studies. This wasn't the one I went to. And you see, we ended up studying the very traditional Oxford Chinese syllabus. There was nothing modern in it. The most modern thing was Lu Xun Xiaoshuo, right? We had to read, A.Q. Zhengzhuan and Kong Yi Jin. That was the most modern thing we did. Otherwise, we did things like Mengzi and Chunqiu Zuozhuan and Dao De Jing and Zhuangzi, and we did do some Feng Meng Long, Bai Hua Xiaoshuo. We read 3 or 4 stories from Jinggu Qiguan, and we read some Yuan Zaju. And of course, I studied紅樓夢. So that was the nature of the syllabus in those days. Nowadays, you don't get syllabuses like that. Nowadays, it's all about, contemporary Chinese politics or international trade or, stuff like that. It's very rare that you'll find this kind of program. I just happened to stumble across it. Excuse me for a moment, I'm just going to have a drink. Okay, well, so there I am studying Chinese at Oxford, and I really enjoyed myself. I had to work terribly, terribly hard. And, I've always been a hard worker when I decide to work. And, God gave me rather an advanced kind of mental apparatus. I mean, I have a brain which seems to function most of the time. So I did quite well in my studies. But you see, at the same time, in the Western world, things were going through a very important phase. The 1960s, that's when I grew up. The 1960s, of course, were the period in which the Beatles became very, very popular. Nowadays, I don't know if anyone even heard of the Beatles, because it's just, but I think I see somebody nodding their head, so I think a few people still know the Beatles. The Beatles were my great heroes. They were one. You could divide. My friends were divided between those who liked the Beatles and those who liked the Rolling Stones. I never liked the Rolling Stones. They weren't my cup of tea at all. But I did like the Beatles. And they were the kind of smiling face of the 1960s, because they were still pretty happy at that stage. Of course, things went badly wrong later. But and then at the same time, on a much heavier note, there was a very strong drug culture, and I couldn't remain separate from that culture. It was all my friends were taking drugs. Some of them taking rather bad drugs, I have to admit. Not I of course. As Bill Clinton said, I never inhaled. Actually, I did inhale quite a lot, but we all did in those days. It was the drug generation, And in America, there was this man called Timothy Leary, who was a great prophet of the drug called LSD, sometimes referred to as acid, which really does change your mind in a very profound way. It's still being used in psychiatry as a way of trying to break through the barriers of depression and so on and so forth. And many of my friends were experimenting with these kinds of drugs. It was all around me. I couldn't avoid it. And that was part of my experience. And you see, the great call of Timothy Leary. He was a horrible man, actually. I read his biography, a very unpleasant person, but he was very influential. And it was he who said, turn on, that means take drugs, right? Turn on, tune in, that means get with it, drop out, that means give up your job, give up your studies, just become, one of the flower people, And this, of course, had a huge influence on me. In fact, probably between the years 1968 and 1977, when I moved to Australia, this would have been the dominant theme in my life. I lived in a number of communes with like-minded people, and we none of us had a job, and we just kind of lived from day to day. But we did lead rather intense lives, in the sense that we were always discovering some new form of ecstasy, after another. I don't mean ecstasy of a drug, I mean ecstasy of the experience. We were very much into, poetry and music and long walks in the woods, and you were always in love with everybody, that was the whole thing. It was the great period of that. And looking back on it, I have to say that I do owe a great deal of my education to those years, because I encountered things I would never have encountered if I just got a job, My brother, who was 3 years older than me, and a very lovely person, we're very close, he went straight from Oxford to become an academic. And for the rest of his life, he was a very highly respected professor of economics. And he still is to this day. He's 75, but he's still a very influential economist in Britain. I didn't do that. I dropped out. And my poor family were absolutely despairing of me, Oh, John, when are you going to get a job, You can't just lie around all day doing nothing except playing the piano and, And I said, but this is usually my mother would say, I say, Mum, leave me alone, I'm fine, I'm really happy, I'm enjoying life. And this went on for about 8 or 9 years. I don't regret a single day of it, I have to say. And then, of course, as I mentioned last week, in 1970 came along this project of translating Hong Lo Meng, and it was almost like by accident. I just drove into Oxford, knocked on David Hawkes's door, and the rest, as they say, is history. And this is the letter I got from him in January 1970, which I think I showed to you last week, in which he proposed the collaboration that from then on became the new focal activity of my life. And slowly I managed to make a transition, I think that's the word, a transition from being an unemployed layabout, a kind of, sort of liumang, to becoming a kind of professional translator. It was a very gradual process. I'd say it took about 10 years, really. I think, how are we doing for time? Oh, it's 3 o'clock. I'm going to pause there because I think it's important to have a pause for 5 minutes and then we'll carry on after that, okay? Thank you. So I took the story up to more or less 1970 when I stumbled across this whole new venture to work with my former teacher David Hawkes on this project, which is what, of course, all these lectures are about. And what I've been trying to do today so far is to tell the story of my life up until that point, and what I'd been through, and what I had absorbed, and then of course I was kind of wandering around doing very little, and then I stumbled across this project, and I did actually take it very seriously from the very beginning, although I was very, very slow to get started because of my lifestyle, I suppose. But the first thing I started to do was to make notes, because David would give me his chapters. As he translated each chapter, he would make carbon copies. Nowadays he'd send me, the Word document by email, but there were no computers in those days. So he used to make, of each chapter, he would make a carbon copy and give me one of the carbon copies as he went along. He was very generous. So I built up my own collection of the carbon copies of this translation as it was progressing. And at the same time I started to reread the novel from the very beginning and to make my own notes. So, for example, this is the page from my notebook about Wang Xifeng. And I put all these little notes, and this is this stands, JB stands for 八社会脚本. That's the Bilingual Edition, and all the different ways that different people called her different things. You see, sometimes she was called Peppercorn Feng. You see, Feng Lat, and sometimes Jia Rong called her Auntie Feng, and different people called her different things. And I was making notes as I went along. RM stands for Renminwenxue Edition. So I give this to you as a document to prove that I wasn't just being lazy, I wasn't just tuning in and dropping out. I wasn't just taking drugs, I was actually doing some hard work as well. But I was very, very slow because, of course, if you imagine yourselves, young people like you, and at the age of 20, what was I, 24, 5, someone says, okay, will you collaborate with me to translate the whole of Shakespeare, right? So then it's pretty terrifying, really. I was suddenly having to come to terms with Hong Lo Meng. I was actually having to engage with this enormous work. And that was really quite hard work. And I've still got all these notebooks. I had a different page for every person, you see. And sometimes I'd quote from other translations. This is Franz Kuhn, you see. This is Wu Shicheng. I had a book by him. And then sometimes I would write notes about the kind of people I knew who reminded me of Wang Xifeng, okay? And here I've written down Penelope. Penelope was the sister of my best friend, and she was a very interesting person. And, when I was trying to think, how would Wang Xifeng talk? I would imagine her talking a bit like this person, Penelope. I won't go into all the details of who Penelope was, but a very interesting character. And Joan Greenwood was a famous actress. And then I wrote down here, Mrs. Julian Blackwell. Now, she's another woman she was the mother of one of my friends at school, and a very outspoken, rather bossy individual, but very elegant, very, very good looking. And so I thought, well, she's a bit like Mrs. Julian Blackwell. And I did this throughout my notebook. I'd put little secret notes about who these people reminded me of, And I don't dare show it to people because sometimes they were members of my family, I might say that aroma, that's Hua Shiren, reminds me of so-and-so, or, that Xue Pan reminds me of so-and-so, and my family wouldn't be so happy about being compared to Xue Pan, for example. But I just show you this one page as an example of the kind of work I was doing at the beginning. A lot of it was what I call preparatory work, And sometimes when you take on a big translation, there's a huge amount of preparatory work. For example, much later in my life, I translated the I Ching, which is another huge book. I don't know why I took on such huge projects, but I did the I Ching all on my own. And I took 12 years altogether to do it. But of those 12 years, I'd say about 7 or 8 years were what I would call preparatory work. Reading, researching, making notes, and I wasn't really ready to translate until after about 7 or 8 years. The same was true of another book I translated called Liao Zhai Zhi Yi. I spent years doing preparatory work because I couldn't understand Liao Zhai Zhi Yi. It was so strange. I mean, what is a Hu Li Jing, for goodness sake? I was so innocent, I didn't understand all that sort of stuff. So it took me years and years and years to understand, what was going on in the minds of Pu Shengling, And that was preparatory work, And this was part of my preparatory work on the Honglao Meng collaboration. You see, David probably didn't bother with stuff like this. He knew so much. He was already in his 50s. He was already a very distinguished scholar. And for him, he was already much more advanced than me. I had to really catch up a lot. So that's one reason why I was so slow producing my translation. Now, I want to put in here a quotation from something I wrote about what I call critical reading, because that was also part of my preparatory work. You see, I'll read it for you. When reading, writing, and translating, it is important to have a way of keeping track of what you have absorbed and learned, so that you can build on it and acquire richer resources for the future. This is how you develop your skills as a translator. When reading, read actively and critically. Jot down interesting expressions, forceful adjectives, little turns of phrase that strike you as effective, as things you might one day be able to use yourself in both languages. And this was something I learned very early on, because I knew I had to improve. I knew I had to work to develop my skills. And what could I do? I certainly wasn't going to read books on translation theory. I'd throw them in the rubbish bin. So instead I started compiling what I called my word book, right? And I often teach students to do that. And the way I did this was to divide language into certain categories. For example, here, ways of speaking, you see, 说话, ways of being silent, 不言语, ways of moving, walking, all these categories, a bit like a thesaurus, you see. And I would, these are some more of them. And I used to spend lots of time collecting expressions, you see. These are just 2 pages from one of my many notebooks. And this is, for me, was a very practical way of training to extend my vocabulary, so that when somebody comes into a room, the simple way of saying it is he walked into the room, but there are probably 20 or 30 other ways of saying it, And a good writer has a huge range of alternatives at his or her disposal. And when you train to become a better translator, you're basically training to become a better writer. And This is one of the most useful things I ever did, and I must have compiled at least a dozen books like this. And whenever I read a novel or whatever, I would keep a very rough notebook and jot things down, and later copy them into my like thesaurus word book, you see. And this way, I would hope to increase my ability to express myself in English. Sometimes I would copy things down and I'd realize I've already copied them down 10 times, because you don't necessarily, it's the difference between what we call passive vocabulary and active vocabulary. If you measure your passive vocabulary, it's huge. You know about lots and lots of words, but how many of those words can you actually use? That's your active vocabulary. Only a fraction. And this practice is helpful in bringing up your passive vocabulary so that you can actually use it. So when you're translating, these ideas pop into your mind, oh yes, I'll use that. I'll use one of the other 20 ways of saying he walked into the room. And then also, making critical reading is not just about words, it's also about ideas. And there's a famous poem in chapter 5 of紅樓夢, which David entitles Mutability. And I didn't know the word mutability, I had to learn it. And I came across the word in George Steiner's After Babel, and or one of George Steiner's books, I can't remember. So I jotted down, under mutability, I jotted down, this passage from George Steiner. I'm a great admirer of George Steiner, where he says, from Chaucer's Troilus to the unfinished 7th book of The Fairy Queen, that's Spenser, the concept has a fascinating history, the concept of mutability. It embodies philosophic, perhaps astrologically tinged notions of universal inconstancy, of an anarchic variable in the, oh God, I can't read that, in the sum of human something, fortune. You see, I should learn to write better because I can't read my own writing, but the point I'm trying to make here is that I would make a lot of notes like this when I'm reading. Very often when I'm reading, I've got a pen in my pocket and a notebook, and I just jot things down because, writers, they steal stuff from other writers. Chinese writers are the worst of all, They steal whole paragraphs from other writers, especially poets, you can read a poet from the Song dynasty and it's mostly made up of quotations from the Tang dynasty, and so on and so forth. That's fine. There's no intellectual property when it comes to creative writing. I don't believe this. You just borrow or steal. And that's how you become better, That's how painters become better. They copy the great masters, And it's part of the discipline of xiuyang, of self-improvement as a translator, to do this kind of thing. That's why I say you've got to read and read and read. But it's not enough to just read. You have to read critically. You have to read in such a way that it becomes yours, You have to make it yours. And you can steal, beg, borrow, whatever. It doesn't matter. There is no ownership. And one of my favorite things recently is going through Hawkes's translation and noticing all the times he borrows expressions from Shakespeare. It's quite staggering. I'm going to talk about that next week in my final lecture, because he was so familiar with Shakespeare. In fact, he was so familiar with the whole of Western literature. It was quite scary working with someone like him, because I knew so little and he knew so much, He didn't know it in a kind of boring way. He just loved it, you see. And so he would just he would make up expressions when he was translating Cao Sui Qin that were, without even knowing it, they were references to Shakespeare, you see. And of course, Cao Sui Qin himself is full of references to the whole of classical Chinese literature. He read everything, Cao Sui Qin was incredibly well read in Chinese literature. And I think to translate it into English, you have to be incredibly well read in English literature as well. And this is something not many critics recognize, you see. So I'd make notes like that. Now, I'm going to very briefly look at some of my letters, because frankly, my letters are a bit childish. I feel a bit embarrassed. I've got all my letters, you see, a great big pile of them there. And they're only interesting because I was writing to a very interesting person, okay? I mean, and he kept all my letters. That's the extraordinary thing. When David died, he had a whole filing box full of my letters, and he left me all of his documents, so they became mine. And I've been spending this week looking at some of my letters, and it's so embarrassing. I can't share many of them with you because I was a young man in search of identity, you know, and really it's quite embarrassing. So I'm not going to look at many of them. I want to move on to his manuscript. I will, however, very quickly take you through this letter. I will share with you. This is written quite late on in 1982. When I'd already finished the 4th volume of the translation. I was living in Tianjin, actually. I wrote this note to David. David, I think this is now complete, except for the preface. That's volume 4, The Debt of Tears, I called it. I'm afraid the typing is patchy, but I really want to keep going on volume 5. And 3 or 4 people have said that it's quite legible enough for a printer. I had about 50 pages retyped and left it at that. I think it might have been sent from Hong Kong, actually, because I went to Hong Kong in 1982. Here, Hong Kong. As usual, I am plagued with doubts about the whole thing, even at this stage. So I call this plagued with doubts because I was always unsure of myself, you know. I was always concerned that I simply wasn't good enough, you know. If you have second thoughts and decide you'd either like to stop at 80, in other words, if you just want to publish the first 80 chapters, or do your own volumes 4 and 5, I will quite understand. So, you know, I was offering to give up. And this is 12 years after I started, right? I feel I've done my best for 4, but really don't know if it's good enough to see the light. Betty Radici, she's the editor from Penguins, is getting a copy, and I'm also very nervous about her reaction. Trying to be objective about it, I suppose it's just a reflection of the fact that I feel generally like creeping into a corner. So in other words, I was suffering from a very terrible fit of depression at the time, and I wrote this very self-doubting letter because that's how I felt. And I still do feel that way. I mean, I'm about to publish a new book, which is a translation of the Tao Te Ching, and I still feel plagued with self-doubt about it, you know. Have I made a terrible mess of it, you know? Everything I do, I'm always half in a mind to just cancel the whole thing because I never know really whether it's any good. And even when people say it's good, I don't believe them, you see. And that's just my personality, that's all. One just has to learn to ignore those things. It's like when you wake up on a bad day and you feel miserable. You mustn't make any decisions, you know, because that's a bad day to make a decision, you know. You just have to sort of somehow get through the day and things will get better, you know, and so on and so forth. Or if you've had too much to drink and you wake up in the morning with a terrible hangover, that's not a good time to make decisions, you know. You need to have a calm mind. And you know, I talk to people and they say, but John, you've been translating and publishing for 52 years. For goodness sake, grow up, you know. Stop doubting yourself. But I can't. It's in my nature. It's in my nature. I could always do better than I do. And frankly, that's just the way it is. I can't change that. I shall be like that until the day I die. That's the way I am. David was exactly the same. I mean, everybody knows he was a genius. He used to say to me again and again, oh God, my life has been a complete waste of time. I've done nothing worthwhile in my life, you know. Because that's the kind of person he was. Far worse than me. He was a seriously depressed individual. He used to wake up some days and he couldn't do a thing. He'd go down to his study, stare at the desk and think, oh, it's impossible. I don't understand a word. And then he'd go out to his garden and dig his vegetables. I mean, this is human nature, you know. And I think people who are totally self-confident about the very high standard of their work are very often the very people who produce bad work, you know. So I'm not saying that necessarily because you have self-doubt you're very good. I'm just saying this is the way it is. Now, lots of these letters I'm not going to stop and talk about because I could spend a whole semester talking about these letters. I'm going to go on. This is the end of one of my letters from America. I just want to point this out. But more than anything else, I hope against hope that somehow I will be able to make up for my clumsiness and show how much your encouragement has inspired me and what a lot the Hong Lao Meng project means to me. So you see, our correspondence was like that. We were very much heart to heart, you know. It was never academic, never. Oh, this is interesting because I wrote when I was still very much searching for a way forward, because I never enjoyed the academic world. I thought I'd go to India. You know, the Beatles went to India, and everybody in those days went to India in search of spirituality, you know, the meaning of life and so on. So I thought I discovered that there was a university in India which had Chinese studies. It was a university founded by a very wonderful man called Rabindranath Tagore. So I thought I might go there, so I copied down the names of the people who were there, Venkataramanan and so on, Mukherjee, and I sent this letter to David. I said, here's the list of the China Bhavan of Visvabharati. And I wondered if he knew them. It turned out he did know them, because Venkataramanan was a student at Bedar in the 40s. So I then got very excited. I thought, I'm going to go to India. But I didn't go, of course. Here's Rabindranath Tagore, you see. You can see why I thought he was so marvelous. Because in those days, everybody worshipped Indian gurus, you know. I very nearly became a kind of member of an Indian cult, you know. That's what they all did in those days. But, of course, Tagore was no longer alive. But the person I wanted to go and join his ashram, his spiritual retreat, was Sri Chinmoy. And he was a very wonderful Bengali Indian guru, and he had an ashram in London. And one day I actually went there. I went to the gate, and these 4 young men met me in white robes, you know, saying, you know, namaste, namaste. And I took one look at them and turned around and ran home, because I knew I wasn't going to ever become an Indian monk, you know. That was just my dream, you know. And anyone who knows me would have said, you're being ridiculous. You'll never be a monk. You'll never last one day in a monastery, you know. I don't think Jabayu would have been a good monk either, you know. Here's the poem, right? And then I'm just going to read you this very, very bad poem which I wrote, which I sent to David in about 1973. This was written shortly after the death of my first wife, when I was in a very strange mental space. This was when I was thinking of going to India and becoming a Hindu disciple. So I wrote this poem called on translating the story of the stone. I mean, I'm very embarrassed to read it to you, but I will share it to you because it gives you some insight into the mental space I was in. Re-entering the orbit of life, drawn to secrets in that constellation of beings, their riddles, their dreams, music heard in the evening, lines of poetry remembered at a turn in a garden walk, flashes from faces seen for the first time, strange coincidences, chance reflections. These are my thoughts about translating Hong Lao Meng, if you can believe it. A flower of life, amazed at itself for continuing to live, mirror-like, magical in its power to enter new lives, transforming them, transforming itself. That's all referring to the novel, you see. Before enlightenment, before atonement with the Supreme, when all need for expression falls away, is art. Footprint of the immortal, unerring movement to the heaven of the illumined soul. Each being that sees it recognizes, shares the bearing, follows, feels anew with powerful impulse its inner flame, until with awe he finds a masterpiece around him and within him, sees himself in the reflection of light itself, and life radiating from the center. In art, the spirit lives forever, here and now, joining these lives that seem apart in our time, in our space, into one instant of joy. I had so many drugs. I mean, I just wrote this ridiculous poem, which I feel, but I'm sharing it with you because it kind of represents very clearly the kind of what I was going through at the time. And in a sense, having gone through that, I was able later, when I came to translate Volume 5, which is all about Jia Baoyu, you know, seeing through the Kanpo Hongchen, you know, and entering into, and going off into the snow with these 2 monks and so on. I think I was able to understand it, you know, better from having been through this kind of typical 1970s, obsession with Indian spirituality and all this kind of stuff. So that's why I share it with you. I've got lots more letters, but I don't have time to look. Oh yeah, I want to look at this one. In 1970, the end of 73 and the beginning of 74, I'd been living, after my first wife's death, I was living with my 2 children. I was basically a single parent, and life was pretty desperate. And I saw an advertisement for a job working in a theatre company up in the north of England to create a school for the children of the theatre company. I thought, that's interesting. I'll go, and I went for an interview, and they gave me the job. And the theatre company was called the Welfare State. The welfare state, of course, is the social security system of the UK. So it was a very humorous name. But they were actually a very famous theatre company. They did these extraordinary outdoor happenings with fireworks and goodness knows what. They were very radical, very progressive. And I worked with them for about a year, basically looking after all the children and trying to create a small school. And I actually found it quite inspiring because I was allowed to do whatever I liked. So, for example, with these small children, I invented a new language, largely based on early Chinese from like the Zhou dynasty. I taught these kids how to write Chinese in a very funny kind of way, and we invented a new language, and we called the stars by different names. We did some pretty crazy things. And then I had a chance meeting with this man called Sir Simon Townley. He was an aristocrat who was the Lord Lieutenant of Lancashire. I can't remember how I met him, but somehow I met him, and he invited me to his mansion. And in the afternoon we had tea, and I met his 2 daughters, who were very lovely, and they played musical instruments, and we ended up playing music. And music is a very important theme in my life, and somehow we ended up playing chamber music together, and we got on very well. And then after tea, Sir Simon Townley said to me, "What are you doing these days?" And I said, "Well, I'm thinking of creating a school." And he said, "Well, I've got 2 farms. I've got 2 big farms up on the hills, which are empty. Would you like to have my 2 farms? And you can create a school up there." And such a generous offer. And I went back to my theatre company and said, "Oh, listen, guys, I've been offered a huge area of hillside with 2 houses on it. Why don't we turn it into a school? The children can learn how to be farmers and grow vegetables." And, it was a typical hippie dream, you see. And the guy who ran the theatre company just looked at me and said, "John, you are so mad, This is not what we want. This is just your hippie dream. I'm afraid you better go." So I left. I never did that. But it was a kind of sign of something I wanted to do. I was never ever going to be a kind of typical academic. I wanted to do something quite idealistic as a child of the 60s and 70s. Lots more letters which I'm not going to talk about today, because I basically, I even tried to learn calligraphy. I'm quite proud of that, actually, for a foreigner, these letters, I'm afraid I'm having to just whiz through. I want to get to, oh yes. So, I'm coming back from me to him, because enough about me. And this is a rather lovely picture of the 2 of us playing music together, because he loved music, I loved music, and this is in my house in France. And we're both tootling away on our recorders. And those are some of my books in the background, you see there. And there's a face of the Buddha, you see. And we're both playing music together. And here's the music. And so I like that picture as a kind of illustration of knowing and sharing the sound. And I now want to move on to David, because I'm going to sit down, excuse me. God, sorry. Is that okay? And now I'm coming to the sort of the nuts and bolts of what happens in a translation, and it's very interesting with the story of the stone, because we can form a very precise diagram, as I've done on this, of the stages it goes through. And of course, the very first stage is the original manuscript, which David wrote in ink with a fountain pen. And I'll just give you a quick preview of that. You see, there's a page of the original manuscript. And that's what I call, well, no, actually the very first stage is he decided, he's a very methodical man, he decided to translate all the poems first, because he knew the poetry in Hong Lam would be very difficult. So he decided, is that okay? He decided to just go through the novel and translate every single poem. And he put those translations into his notebooks. And those notebooks he then gave to me much later, and they were reprinted by Lingnan University. So you can purchase those notebooks as a book. And in those notebooks you'll find all the translations of the poetry. It's very, very interesting. That's a subject for another lecture. But so having done that, he then started at the beginning and wrote a handwritten manuscript of the entire novel, with corrections on the manuscript, some of which were in red, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes. And having done that, he then did what he called his rough typed version. You see, there were no computers in those days, no Microsoft Word or whatever, and he did his first typing, which was quite rough because he did it himself. And in the course of doing that, he would have made some more corrections. And then he would give the rough typed version to a professional typist called Mrs. Halsey, and she then did a best, what we call a best version, and that was sent to Penguins, to the publisher, with handwritten corrections on it by Hawkes. And those best typed versions, where he made carbon copies, and I received copies of all those chapters. Unfortunately, I've lost all my chapters from Volume 1. I don't know where they went to, but I still have all the typed chapters from Volumes 2 and 3, and they're one of the treasures I still have. And many of those best typewritten versions have got handwritten corrections on them. So then, Penguins then do the typesetting, and they send him the proofs. And he goes over the proofs, and sometimes he makes changes on the proofs. You can tell that. He makes changes which are not just bad spellings. He actually has more ideas. He keeps changing and changing and changing, you see, and sends them back. And then the book, stage 6, the book is published. But even when the book is published, sometimes he'll make corrections for the second or third printings. For example, on the first page of the first chapter, he made a terrible mistake with a number. You know, the number of stones that Nuwa melted down. He got it wrong. You know, I can't remember the exact figure now, but instead of being 365, it was 36,000. And I said to him many times, I said, David, you've got that number completely wrong. Oh, shut up, John, you don't know what you're talking about. So he sent it, because he could, you know, he was the boss, you know. But only, and typically when the book finally came out in print, he showed, he said, oh my goodness, I made a mistake on the first page, as if I'd never told him, you know. That's typical, you know, it's typical. And then he changed it. So if you have a copy of the first printing, it's very rare. I have one, it's got the wrong number. So you can identify, it's the kind of thing that book collectors, it'll make it very valuable eventually, because that first printing, you can identify it by the number on page 1. And later on he corrected it on subsequent printings. And then in 2012, there was a bilingual edition that came out, that came out in Shanghai. And for that edition, a lot more corrections were made. So actually, the final edition, at the moment, the most complete and corrected edition is the 2012 Shanghai Hanying Dui Zhaoban. And when Penguins finally reprint it, they will incorporate all of those changes, because they were all approved of by David. So you see, it's quite an elaborate sequence of events, and that makes it even more interesting to look at the original manuscripts and typescript. It's a kind of translation archaeology, you know, where you dig up these things from the past, and by looking at the exact sequence of events, you start to understand the mind of the translator. That's what interests me. I'm not a textual scholar, I'm not a scholar at all, but I'm very interested in what goes on in the mind of a really great translator, of a true master. And this is what I hope to show you. Oh God. And just before looking at the manuscript, I'm showing you here 3 pages from the typescript, which is in my possession. I didn't bring the whole thing because it would have been so heavy, but just these pages. This is his best typescript. And you can see he's still correcting it. Okay, now then we come to the manuscript. This is the last section of my talk. Now, this manuscript was actually purchased by the Chinese University of Hong Kong many years ago, and I was able to arrange for it to be deposited in the library of Chinese University and put online. So if you go to these 2 sites, the first one is the actual manuscript, which is online, so anybody can look at it. And the second one is the link to all the other documents which are in the Hawkes archive. I donated them all to the library some 4 or 5 years ago, and they've done a wonderful job of cataloguing them. So there are hundreds of letters and all sorts of things, and it's a fascinating resource which I set up when I was staying at Chinese University in 2012. That's 6 years ago. So that's where you can find this. But what I've done is I've converted the pages, well actually Sean helped me convert the pages from chapter 27 into individual documents, and by looking at these you can really see into the mind of the translator. I'm going to try standing up because otherwise I can't see what the hell's going on. Let me get this. Okay. Oh. Okay. So here we are. This is page 1, and this. Just remember, this is the actual physical manuscript that David used for his first draft. He always believed in writing with a fountain pen, and his writing is terribly clear and legible. I mean, no problem reading it, whereas the notebooks is not at all clear and legible. So if we just take the very first example, this chapter ends up with the very long poem in which Dayu buries the flowers, you know, very famous long poem. But it's a very interesting chapter, full of little incidents that reveal the personalities of the individuals, the maids and so on. And at the very beginning, you know, Dayu is weeping. She's always weeping, you know. And he starts up, as Dayu stood there sorrowing, and he changes it to weeping, right? That's just something he does as he goes along. Very often he simply has second thoughts, and he crosses out the first thought, and he puts the new thought on top. There was a sudden creak of the courtyard gate, and Bao Chai walked out, and his first idea was followed by, and then second idea was seen off by, and the third idea was accompanied by. And you see, I think I did go to the trouble of this. This is the print. This is the final printed edition. You see, and weeping has been kept. Accompanied by has been kept. I didn't have time to do this for every single page because it takes an age, you know. So, accompanied by Bao Yu, aroma, and a bevy of maids. And I think in the end he says, in the final printed edition, he says a bevy of other maids who'd come out to see her off. Now, you see, sometimes we can't tell if the changes took place between the manuscript and the first typescript, or between the first typescript and the second typescript, or indeed on the actual proofs from the publisher. Because David, and this is the point I want to make more than anything else, David went on revising and revising and fine-tuning and rewriting right up to the last moment, you know. And then, once the book was published, he refused to even look at it. He refused to change anything once it was, apart from that stupid number on page 1, which he changed, because it was so obviously wrong. But I mean, he was often tempted to go back and revise it, and he said, I'm never going to do that, because that's something which happened at a particular moment in time, and it has a certain value for what it was then. And I followed the same example. Most of the other ones here are quite minor. But for example, down here you see, Nightingale and Snow Goose had long since become habituated to Dayu's moody temperament. They were used to her unaccountable fits of depression, when she would sit, the picture of misery, in gloomy silence, broken only by occasional gusty sighs, and to her easy tears. Now, you see here, he changed a full stop there to a comma, and instead of starting a new sentence, he runs these two together. And you start to, when you look at this manuscript in great detail, as I have, you start to recognize certain tricks that he had. I mean, he wanted to... sorry, I pressed that by mistake. Dear, oh dear. I think, above all, he wanted his translation to flow effortlessly, so that people would never pause and think, oh my God, this is a translation. He wanted it to read like a novel, so it was supposed to be very reader-friendly. And sometimes he would run things together, sometimes he would shorten them. He often would prune them down. We'll see some examples of that later. Oh yes, I think it's very interesting to compare this and this with this. Now this is the version by Yang Xianyi and Gladys Yang. I don't often like to make comparisons, but it's so interesting because theirs is so basic. It's what you might call basic English, you know. And if you look at this, Zijian, first of all, they don't translate the maids' names. They just call them Zijian and Xueyan, right? Whereas David called them Nightingale and Snow Goose. They knew their young mistress's ways. She would often sit moodily frowning or sighing over nothing, or, for no apparent reason, would give way to long spells of weeping. At first they tried to comfort her, imagining that... And you see, this is what you might call... It's fine, you know. There's nothing wrong with it. But it just doesn't sort of carry you away, you know. If you go back to David, you know, they'd long since become habituated to her moody temperament. They were used to her unaccountable fits of depression, when she would sit, the picture of misery, in gloomy silence, broken only by an occasional gust. I mean, this reads like a novel, you know. It reads like Charlotte Bronte, or you know, even Jane Austen, or you know, Thackeray, or something. It reads like someone who's writing a novel. Whereas the Yangs, they were actually obliged by a party committee, right? There was a party committee supervising their work, and they were not allowed to have any freedom at all. It had to be igatsu. They were literally made to do a literal translation, and that's very useful. If you buy the bilingual edition of the Yang's translation, you can follow it word by word, because that's how they operated. The party secretary told them how to translate, told them which bandan, which edition to use, and everything. And I'm not making that up. That's what Gladys Young wrote herself in a letter to David Hawkes. She said, we so envy you, your freedom, we so envy you what you do, but we can't do that. We're not allowed to. And you see, next week when I talk about, my talk is called In the Garden of Perfect Freedom. I'm trying to say that without freedom, you can't translate. That one of the big problems with the translation of Chinese literature is that people are not free. Nowadays they're not allowed to be free, but for much longer than that they've been weighed down by this oppressive sense of having to be faithful to the original text, to the point where they don't actually allow themselves any freedom at all. Now, of course, the great exception to that was Lin Shu. And Lin Shu's translations were just marvelous, you know, but they're completely unfaithful, you know. They're very creative, you know. Now, David actually is a kind of inverted example of Lin Shu, except that, of course, Lin Shu knew no foreign languages, whereas David knew Chinese very well. But David takes enormous liberties, and he introduces expressions, you know, which are very, very English, and which are not necessarily to be found in the Chinese. Whereas the Yangs, theirs is very useful as a companion to the Chinese. If you want to read the Chinese of紅樓夢, but you need some help from the translation. Read the Bilingual Edition with the Yang's translation. It's very useful, but don't read the Yang's translation for enjoyment, because it's not very enjoyable. They didn't enjoy translating it either. I know that. This page, this is the second page, and you can see there's very little correction on that page. Now this, I think this expression doesn't come in the manuscript at all. Oh yes, it does. Sorry. I think it's removed from the printed version, that's the problem. And here's page 3. Again, page 3, there's virtually no corrections at all. So it varies enormously. Sometimes things would go so well that he would just get it right first time, you know. And then sometimes, here you see as an example, Baoyu and Daoyu have known each other since they were little, she reflected. This is Xie Bao Chai. They're used to behaving uninhibitedly when they are alone together. They don't seem to care what they say to each other. And he changed that to, they don't watch what they say. I actually prefer the original, actually, but then he changed it to that. Down at the bottom here, you see, having reached this decision, I think that the Chinese is xiang bi, you know, a bi de bi. Having thought this through, you see. And he, first of all, he said, having reached this decision, then he wrote, having thus resolved, having decided. And the final version was, I think, something even different. So you can see, I think the lesson we have from this is that he was constantly changing and constantly improving until something felt exactly right. And you can feel the intensity of his precision and the care with which he continued to revise and revise and revise until he got what he felt was the right expression. And here's a page with virtually no corrections at all. And sometimes they're very tiny things, like, you know, here. These are just little tiny turns of expression, you know. Are you going to give me a reward? I hope I shan't have had this trouble of finding it for you. And then he changes it to, I hope I shan't have taken this trouble to find it for you for nothing. And so this is an example of where he tries to simplify, he tries to make it, he tries to prune it, you know. Pruning is when you remove the unnecessary branches from a tree or a shrub. And it's a very special art, pruning, you know. I know because I did it for 5 years in my vineyard in France. You have to prune it exactly the right way. And so a lot of what David was doing was a kind of pruning, you know, reducing things to the simplest possible form. Here's a page 7 which is almost untouched. And here's another place where he started by saying, she insisted on walking inside. She made a point of going inside the pavilion. And so many times, these are just little changes of words, you know. To us, they may seem, you may hardly see the point, but to him, they were very important. See here, oh dear, sorry. Here he's written, what are you doing gadding about like this, said Skybright as soon as she saw who it was. Originally he wrote, there are the flowers to water and the birds want feeding. And he decided to change it to, the flowers want watering, there are the birds to feed. So it's like he's switching it round, you know. But he feels that flows better. It's very hard sometimes to say what it is about it, but he develops a very fine sense of judgment about what sounds better, you know. Here in Master Bao said yesterday, and said he changed it to Master Bao gave orders yesterday. This page is almost without Here, you see, sometimes it's small things. Crimson found the two of them talking together. He changes it to in conversation. Sometimes in such a way that she could not answer them, in such a way that she was unable to. Now, why would he want? I think it's just purely to do with the rhythm of the words, you know. Sometimes if you read things aloud, especially, you can sense that one rhythm is a lot more fluent than another. And that's where, of course, you need experience. The great French novelist Gustave Flaubert, he used to go to the bottom of his garden and shout every sentence that he'd written aloud until he felt it was the right rhythm. I recommend you to do that. But don't shout it where someone else is listening, because you just try and find a nice place where you can shout and no one will hear. Again, this page is almost completely uncorrected. So, see there, he's just removed two words. Several times about it, before she could begin to mend her ways. Just remove the begin, before she could mend her ways. That's fine. When you can do something in fewer words, why not? Provided it doesn't sound awkward. I could talk for a very long time about many of these pages, but we unfortunately don't have time. Here we are. She hurried over her toilet and went out as soon as it was, and started off. He preferred to say went out. Dayu turned back, ignoring him, to address Nightingale, and called Nightingale. Again, he feels this is more what my grandmother would have called convincing, you know. It just reads better. You can't produce rules about this. He now hastened, therefore, with energetic bowing and hand pumping, to offer the apologies that the previous day's emergency had left no time for, had caused him to neglect. I think this is where, you know, where one has to resort to that Chinese word "ya." You know, it's what sounds better. It's what's more more fluent. And again, you just have to trust your own ear. This is why hearing the sound is such a good expression for this particular skill. And sometimes, as here, he just decides to reorder a sentence so that this comes before that one. Because he thinks it sounds better when this comes first. And that's what this sign means, you see. As I've said, you can download all of this from the internet. It's been put online. It was one of the conditions upon which I donated all the letters to the Chinese University Library, was that they should digitize the manuscript and put it online. So it's available for anyone who wants to read it. It would make a wonderful PhD thesis, actually. Someone could write a superb study of this manuscript, just this manuscript alone. I mean, I've only shown you a few examples. All this, he stood still and listened to what the weeping girl. He stood. This is after Lin Dayu's poem, long poem about burying the flowers. He stood still and listened to what the weeping girl was saying. He stood still to catch what the weeping girl was saying. It's a very subtle difference in meaning there, you know. And definitely, that's a definite improvement. It's much more vivid. You can actually sense by you trying to hear what Dayu is saying, you know, in that very moving poem. All this, and this means I've already translated the poem. No need to put it in, because he'd already done that. You see, he'd already translated the poem before, so he doesn't copy it out again. He would have typed it out when he did his first typing. All this was uttered in a voice half choked with sobs, for the words recited seemed only to inflame the grief of the reciter. And he changed that to but. Bao Yu, listening on the other side of the rock, was himself so overcome by them that he had already flung himself weeping upon the ground. Now, just adding that single word, himself, makes a huge difference to that sentence. These little things like that are really, many of the ways he revises his own work are what I would call, the sign of a true master. I'm sorry I've had to go through this rather superficially. I should have really devoted a whole lecture to this. I want to end by quoting some reflections of mine about what, in the end, what is the lesson from all of this? What do we learn? And this is to a certain extent prefiguring what I'm going to be saying next week when I talk about the Garden of Perfect Freedom. I'm going to be drawing some very general conclusions using specific examples of ways in which Hawkes exercises enormous freedom. But as translators, we must be courageous, free, and passionate about what we are doing. We must constantly strive to enrich our own cultural and linguistic repertoire. We must read, we must write, we must be prepared to rethink, to revise, to rewrite constantly. We must have endless time and patience. Deadlines are there to be ignored. Sorry. I've never ever finished a book by the deadline, never. They're there to be kept alive. I always think a deadline should be kept alive. It should be a live line, a lifeline, So deadlines are there, sorry, I should misprint, to be ignored. Above all, we must play with words, ideas and feelings. We must delight in them. We must never lose sight of the playfulness and creative license that are the lifeblood of art and literature, and hence of translation. And this is David, in his interview that he conducted with one of my students in Oxford. I felt when I started translating this, that's紅樓夢, that I enjoyed it so much. I thought what I'd like to do is a translation where I don't have to think about academic considerations or scholarly considerations. I'll just think about how to present this book in such a way that I do the whole of it, but at the same time it's enjoyable for the English reader, if possible, and that they can get some of the pleasure out of it that I got myself. So you see, this is his theory of translation. He wants to share the pleasure, the enjoyment, and it's mine as well. Thank you very much. Already, okay. All right. Okay. Okay. I'm very happy to try and answer your questions if you have any. It's been quite a long afternoon. Yes, there's somebody got their hand up in the middle there.
Professor, thanks very much for your very inspiring talk. I'm not a student here, but because of all the work that you have done. So that's why I'm here. I want to ask you, because now in the English-speaking world, you have people like using American English or British English or Australian English. When you do the translation, do you think it matters when you choose your words? Would you think about, okay, I will stick to basically British English? For just one thing, you can have an expression very differently in these like three kinds of English. This is my first question. And the second question would be, languages, they also change, they have a life. So maybe what you translate like 30 years ago sounds a bit like old-fashioned. It's just like Bible. Okay, King James Version is always considered as a classic. But like afterwards, people will make it into modern English. So what would you think would be like a reasonable lifespan of a sort of like classic translation in a certain language? Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll try and answer those two questions separately. I mean, I can't write anything except British English because I'm British. I grew up in Britain and to a certain extent, and although I've lived in Australia for a long time, when I write British English. And my publisher, recently I've published 3 books with Viking Penguin in New York, and they automatically changed the spelling to American spelling. I can't do anything about that. And I don't mind about that. I don't care about spelling. Shakespeare, the name Shakespeare was spelt in about 12 different ways in the Elizabethan times. So spelling is a relatively recent thing. No, I'm 100%, I write British English. And I think American readers are perfectly happy to read something that's written in British English. They will take one look at the biographical note and see that the translator's from Britain, and then they expect, certain British usages. The second one is more difficult. You see, I don't believe the King James Bible will ever die. I think the Good News Bible is very bad news. If you try reading the Good News Bible, I can't bear it because I have the King James version ringing in my ears. So I always say Good News Bible is bad news. Even the New English Bible, which was written by a committee, of course the King James Bible was done by a committee as well, but it was done at a time when English prose was magnificent, I think that my first response to your question, which is a very difficult one, is that Chao Chin wrote in the 18th century, and it's still read today, and sometimes it's not easy, it needs footnotes and so on. I think what David Hawkes tried to do, and I just followed him, he was the master, I was his apprentice, was to create, not to get into a very modern style, not to create a very old-fashioned style, but to try to create a sort of timeless style, hoping that it will last a certain time. One can't tell. It's not particularly modern. It doesn't read like Henry James, for example, although he was a great admirer of Henry James, but it reads like a sort of timeless English. That's what we're aiming at. And that's what the editor, Betty Radici, was so angry with me for, because when I started off, I made those girls talk like hippies, and she was very wise to correct me and say, you can't do this, You can't suddenly, in chapter 81, have all these people talking like hippies in a commune, They're aristocratic Chinese living in a very refined elite environment. So I learnt my lesson pretty fast. And then I had to learn how to write the same kind of timeless narrative style that David was so good at, I had such a perfect model to follow. I was never as good as him, But, I console myself with the fact that he thought it followed on quite well from his first 80 chapters. And I think I'm not going to say there won't be another translation that will be better, eventually, maybe in 50 years' time, when the language has changed. But, I can't imagine, forget about my part, I can't imagine anyone surpassing what David has done with those 80. It's a classic of English literature. It's no longer just a translation, it is a classic. And there have been some very interesting articles written about that. One by a woman from Yale called Chloe Starr. It's a very good piece, actually, in which she says that. She says it's time we stopped talking about the Hawkes. She calls it the Hawkes Minford stone, but I would just refer to Hawkes. It's time we stopped talking about it as a translation. It's really a work of English literature. It's a masterpiece, and I completely agree. It's a stunning. There's nothing like it in the history of translating Chinese. There's nothing like it, and he manages to raise it to a certain level, where he creates a kind of timelessness, which is neither Chinese nor English. It's something else, It's something else altogether, and I think that's the solution. That's what he tries to do. And I think personally, I actually think it will last as long as the King James version of the Bible. His part. My part's just tacked on at the end, I just get a free ride, It's like I get one of those special, octopus cards that gives you a discount, Because I'm just able to just ride in the last carriage of the train, but his stuff is the main thing. And it is of such amazing quality. I think it'll last a long time. I can't predict, but I think it'll last a long time because it aims at a timelessness. That's the point.
Hi, Professor Minford. Thank you very much for your great sharing. So I enjoyed your talk very much, and thanks a lot for sharing those manuscripts with us. I have a very short question and want to have your confirmation. So you just mentioned that the manuscripts are. I'm wondering whether there are any drafts before the handwritten manuscripts, because it seems that the manuscripts are hardly revised at all as compared to the final version of the printed version. So are there any drafts of the drafts before the handwritten manuscripts? Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, as I mentioned, all the poems were drafted before the manuscript. In fact, when you come to a poem in the manuscript, he leaves it out because he's already done the draft. Those come in his notebooks, and you can look at those. It's very interesting. I don't quite agree with you. There's actually a lot of changes in the draft. I mean, you might have 2 or 3 pages with nothing, and then suddenly you hit a very, very densely corrected. And sometimes he crosses out the whole page and starts again. So, no, there wasn't an earlier draft. That was the first draft of the main narrative. The poems, yes, the poems are in a separate book, the notebooks. And he translated all of the poems. He copied out all the Chinese as well. I mean, he was a very methodical person, and he wanted to get them right. So basically, the answer to your question is no. This is the first draft. But as I pointed out earlier on, in addition to the corrections he makes on the draft, there are subsequent corrections made at every stage along the way. You know, not a huge number, but significant. And what you can learn from that is so valuable. I mean, once you've looked at several chapters of the draft, of the manuscript, you really get a feel for what he was doing, you know. You can learn, it's almost like you're in the presence of the master, you know. It's the master at work. That's what it is. And it's fascinating. I think there's a huge amount to be learned from it. You have to read the whole thing, really. By the time you get to the end, you read it. What I think you should do is to read it. If you have a copy of the bilingual edition, it's very handy because it's got the Chinese on one side and the English, the final version of the English printed text on the right. And if you look at the manuscript with that in front of you, you can see that sometimes there's quite a gulf between his corrections on the manuscript and the final version. It goes through all these different stages, and that's fascinating. I think what we learn from that is that we must continue, as I said in my last remark, continue to revise, continue to rewrite, rethink, until we gradually focus more and more clearly on the meaning of the original. Not the words, but he was always very anxious. For example, one of the things that comes through in the manuscript is how concerned he was about knowing exactly where people are and what they're doing, not to be vague, because Sanskrit is not vague. If someone's in a corner of a room, they should be in a corner of a room, not somewhere else. If there are 4 people at a dining table, there should be 4 people and not an unnumbered group. So it's very, very, although that's one of the great paradoxes of his work, although it's very free in lots of ways, it's also very precise, very, very precise, which is why these stupid theorists who talk about, domestication and foreignization, I mean, if I ever hear those words again, I'll probably scream, because they're so completely irrelevant. I mean, Hawkes was both domesticating and foreignizing all the time. All the best translators do both. It's so childish, it really is secondary school stuff. I mean, that's why I never refer to it except to be rude about it. But I mean, he was both very, very precise and incredibly faithful to the text, by which I mean all the different texts, because he was always reading different banban, and at the same time as being very, very scholarly and precise, he was incredibly free. I mean, incredibly unfaithful, incredibly unfaithful. I'll be talking about that next week, because I love to talk about how unfaithful he was. And he knows it's true, I know it's true as well. But that's the secret to his magic, you see.
Professor, you are saying being unfaithful. So how would you say your masterpiece is kind of a recreation, or how you rank it, how you score the masterpiece as kind of a level of recreation?
I think all these words have different shades of meaning. It's a spectrum, you know. There's no one answer to your question. I mean, the trouble is people use the word recreate in a rather sort of negative sense, that someone's been totally, you know, outrageously, they've stolen someone's work and then hung their own clothes on it. That's not what I mean. I think it's a very subtle thing. You can be unfaithful and yet completely faithful. You can be, because what you're doing is, that's why I've called my last lecture In the Garden of Perfect Freedom, because if you perfectly understand what's going on, you can be perfectly free. If you're just playing around and you don't understand it, then you're just messing about, you know. There's lots of that. I call them more imitations, you know. I don't mind those, they're fine. They're good fun, you know, but they're not real translations. So I would want to make a distinction between a really inventive translation that seeks to go beyond the words to the deeper meaning. And you could call that a recreation, and that's quite different from an imitation which just skims across the surface and picks a few things and then creates its own sort of, you know, version that's kind of not really a translation at all. And in a sense, those are both recreations, you know, but in a very different sense. So as I said, it's a spectrum of ideas. Only very rarely do you find someone who is both incredibly textually scholarly and precise, and at the same time incredibly free. That's a very, very rare thing. You know, sometimes Arthur Waley is like that, but even Arthur Waley, he doesn't reach the same level. He was different. I can't think of anyone else, frankly, who was able to do that quite the way Hawkes did, because he was a very, very unusual person.
Professor, I noticed that for some characters, you would do direct translation, transliteration of the name. But for some characters, you would choose to translate the meaning and make it the main. How do you draw the line between the two groups? This is my first question. Second question is, I noticed that you speak a lot of languages, and you've experienced, apart from Chinese and English, you experience also other cultures, like Arabic language, culture, and also Latin and Greek. How do you think these other languages, especially Asian languages, would affect a translator's perspective in doing translation in other languages?
Oh my goodness, it's always hard when people ask two questions. What was your first question again? Sorry.
The first question is two different groups of name. One is just transliteration. The other group is...
Okay, yeah, that's very easy. I didn't solve this one, it was David, because you see, he's always very conscious of his reader, you know. He wants his reader to be having a good time. And, you know, you ask any non-Chinese person how they cope with Chinese names. That's why teachers tend to call Chinese students, you know, Mary or Jimmy, you know, because they can't remember Ching Chong Chinaman, you know. Chinese names are very hard. You find out how many non-Chinese people can actually pronounce the name of China's great leader, Xi Jinping, you know. I mean, Xi Jinping, you know, they you know, even like the BBC, they get it all wrong, you know, because, you know, it's Chinese names are terribly hard, you know, and if you don't want to lose your reader on page 2, you better do something about the names, you know. And so Hawkes thought about this long and hard, and he came up with a solution which I think works very well, which is to divide the people into groups. And first of all, you have the upper class, the aristocratic people, the Jia family, right? They all get to have their names transliterated like Bao Yu, Dai Yu, right? So he doesn't call them precious jade or whatever. He just calls them with Chinese names, Jia Zhen, Jia Zheng, so on and so forth. And then you have the servants. There's a lot of servants in Hong Lamang, a bit like Downton Abbey, it's full of servants. And so he decided the servants, to make it clear that these are the class down, he'd translate their names. So, Hua Xiren becomes aroma, and so on. Qingwen becomes sky bright, and Ming Yan becomes tea leaf. So the minute you see names like that, you know that these are servants. That's pretty clever. Now there's another category of people. They come quite a lot. Religious people, monks and nuns. So he thought he'd call them by Latin names, right? Euergesia or Sapientia, those are two nuns, and Misterioso and so on and so forth. So if you come across Vanitas, Kong Kong Daoren, he calls Vanitas, right? Because Vanitas in Latin means emptiness, you see. It doesn't mean vanity, look in the mirror, oh, Russia. No, it means emptiness. All is vanity, you see. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. That's the Bible. So Latin names for religious people. And then the last category is what you might call slightly naughty people. I mean, sing-song girls, ladies who perform in the sing-song house, the gullo, the gullo. And people like, for example, there's a sing-song girl in chapter 28 out of 26 called Yunar. Yun means a cloud, right? Yunar, and she sings a song at the party given by Feng Ziying. She's a pretty girl from a sing-song house, and Xue Pan's always slapping her on the bottom. He would be in jail today for doing that. But I mean, she's a sing-song girl, and he calls her nuageuse, right? Which is the French word for cloudy. Nuageuse, because the English always believed the French were naughty, you see. So, if you're a prostitute, you're bound to have a French name, you see. And he also, all the actresses, there are these 12 little girls who perform plays, he gives them all French names, élégante, charmante, etc. And because the English thought the French were naughty, the French always thought the English were naughty. That's the French-English relationship. But by translating all those names into French, he gave the reader, first of all, he made life easier for the reader, because the reader can read French more easily than Chinese. So if the reader sees a name like Parfumé, they can probably read it, Whereas if they see, Fang Guan, it just sounds like sort of bing bong, ping pong, They don't know what it means, Because Chinese names mean something. And to a Chinese person, when they see them written in characters, they mean something. Of course, if they see them in pinyin, they don't mean anything at all. So this name thing is very complicated. But that was a system that David worked out. Sorry, what was your second question?
It's about borrowing something from other cultures or even Asian languages. Yeah.
Oh, yes. I don't know Arabic at all, by the way. I don't know where you got that idea from. I tried learning Japanese, but I was very unsuccessful. I speak French. French is my second language. Chinese is my third language. And I did study Latin and Greek at school, and I have a working knowledge of German. But, frankly, I don't think it makes the slightest bit of difference. I mean, if I'd known Japanese, I could have used the Japanese translation. David knew the Japanese translation quite well. He had a copy on his shelves. I have a copy, but I can't read it. I can read the kanji, I can read Hanzi. But I mean, you know the way people read Japanese when they don't know Japanese, they jump from one kanji to the next. And they often get it completely wrong. So frankly, I don't think it affects any way. I mean, I was able to use Latin for my translation of Bao Yu doing Bao Guwen, I decided to translate it into Latin. So in that respect, I was able to use my Latin, and that was jolly useful. But otherwise, it's mainly a transaction between Chinese and English, Oh, one question from Gilbert.
Yeah.
You're still awake, I'm surprised.
Always awake.
You see, Gilbert and I both go back to the 60s. That's what we discovered in the mid talk break, that we're both creatures of the hippie era. Right.
We were all hippies, right?
We were all. Yeah. You were in Toronto. I was in Oxford. You know.
Right. Yeah. So now, interesting talk. I think I totally agree with you with the, the kind of freedom that you talk about. I guess we could call it translated freedom. But going back to David Hawkes' translation, I think when I was at school, I read his translation of Du Fu, right, and Qu And as soon as I can remember, the textbooks that the books that he put out, when he translated the poems, he actually put the Chinese characters, right there, and then translate the Chinese characters word by word first, before combining them. Now, I think was that his early phase, or was that a kind of different method of translating poems and prose, or what do you think? What do you make of that? Because I think his translation of Du Fu and Qu actually have the merit of being very faithful to the original, and also very readable, reader-friendly.
Yeah. Well, have you finished?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just trying to make sure you finish. The thing is that with the Du Fu book, the little primer of Du Fu, the Americans pronounce it primer. I always pronounce it primer. What he did was, I don't know what motivated him to do that book. He was teaching poetry at Oxford. Maybe he wanted to have a textbook. But he took all the poems by Du Fu, which come in Tang Shi San Bai Shou. He chose all those poems, and then he deliberately didn't translate them. He just, as you said, went word for word explanation, and at the end he wrote a prose paraphrase, right? Because he just felt they were almost untranslatable, because Du Fu is very, very hard to translate. And so that was a very special case. I mean, it was like a textbook, as you said. It was a textbook for people. I still think it's the best book for people who are studying Chinese. They want to know how to read Chinese poetry. Read that book, because it's very wonderful. And he goes literally word by word, and he gives an introduction on the meter, the prosody, the tonal thing. So it's quite technical, but it's also incredibly well written. I mean, it's very entertaining. You come away from each poem feeling like you've really read it. But it was a different approach completely. And with the Chuzi, with the Quanyuan, that was, of course, his PhD thesis. That was his first book. And there was an early edition done for Oxford University Press. And then much later on in the 1980s, he completely revised the commentary. He didn't really change the translation. But you see, it is a very different approach to the紅樓夢, because he sticks very closely to the Chinese. But on the other hand, it reads very, very well, because he just knew how to write English, that's all I can say. He didn't feel, in the case of Quanyuan, he needed to exercise the same degree of freedom, because this is short, intense poetry. And therefore the reader is reading it quite slowly and can sort of cope with this kind of direct translation. Whereas with紅樓夢, it's a story. He's telling a story. He needs to keep the reader engaged for 120 chapters. That's twice as long as War and Peace, And it's the longest novel pretty much, in the world. And you've got to keep them, if this was on Netflix, you'd have to keep them coming back for the next episode, because that's how a novelist works. The novelist tries to tell a story and cast a spell. And I think that's what led him to exercise more freedom, because it's quite different from poetry. In fact, most of his poetry translation, because he did a few other things as well, is very, very close to the original. He didn't exercise a great deal of freedom. And but when he came to do this novel, it's a different kettle of fish altogether. And that's what prompted him to go off in the direction of freedom. And he threw caution to the winds. He just decided to hell with it, I'm going to give it a go, And I don't, by that stage also, it was later in his career, he didn't care what scholars said, When I did my I Ching, I said to David, "Oh, David, I'm so worried about my I Ching, I'm sure all the scholars will attack it." He just said, "John, who gives up?" For the scholars, just ignore them, Do your thing, do it the way you want to do it. And in the end, what other people say doesn't count. And that was his view, you see. And with Hong Lamang, I mean, some people have attacked him, especially in mainland China, where there's this obsession with fidelity, with faithfulness, which is very damaging, I think. It's caused some very bad translations to appear. And they can always criticize people for not having got the Chinese right, But what they don't understand is whether or not the English is good. And therefore, pretty much 100% of the mainland critiques are complete rubbish, because they are not in a position to judge the quality of the final product. All they can do is focus on the Chinese. Well, frankly, read the Chinese then, don't bother to read a translation, because translations are a different thing altogether. But I think you're quite right, it was an earlier stage in his career, and also a different genre. It was poetry, And he was a huge expert on poetry. He understood, he wrote Chinese, he wrote Liu Shi and Ci. He published some of his Chinese poems, in the紅樓夢西遊記. And he knew so much about Chinese poetry that he felt constrained by the genre. And that's why he never really, after the Du Fu book, he never really did another book. That was his last book in the poetry field. I think time's pretty much running out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Minford, for yet another
Thank you.
enlightening talk.